Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today at Women for Solutions webinar, where we are proud to share this is our 137th webinar where we create awareness, connection, learn, inspire to action to reimagine how our world will be and how it's gonna become. I'm Laura Jadru-Koch, founder of Women for Solutions, a global network of thousands of women, worldwide entrepreneur and intrapreneur in over 40 countries that share simple and effective solutions towards a caring economy. Very simple tools, but you will hear today in our topic. Today is exploring and advancing racial equity in organizations and communities. And our speaker and friend, Marisa Zalabak, is amazing. She will share the best of the best with 40 years of experience in training and supporting organization in culture and social emotional learning and well-being, in creative thinking and conflict mediation and social justice. So Marisa is also a member of the leadership of Women for Solutions. She is a founder of Open Channel Culture and creator of Human Lab Arts Lab. She is involved in training and support educational institution, mental health professionals, and businesses, not only private but NGOs. She's also co-author of IEE's new release recommendations for the ethical design of artificial intelligence and its current development. She leads workshops in regenerative practices and programs to innovate education for the future. I mean, Marisa is amazing, and if you know her personally, you will love her. So, before I give her the word, the empowering move of Women for Solution. That is, let's put our shoulders back. Stand if you're standing. Stand up if you can. Chin up. Eyes that twinkle with joy and determination, and with a super wide smile, because smiling is the essence of life. Marisa, the line is all yours.
Thank you. What a beautiful introduction. Thank you, Laura. I'm delighted to be here. And before we begin, what I would really love for anyone who is here is to, if you would please put in the chat, I'm going to do it as well. If you would please put in the chat where you are in the world right now, right? One of the beautiful things about this community is that we have people from all over the world, right? So we'd like to see, where people are beaming in from. Beautiful. Let's see where we have. We have Brooklyn, not far from me. I'm in New York City. We have Ecuador, beautiful. Buenos Aires. We have Chicago, Illinois, Boston, Florida, London. Wonderful, spectacular. Ecuador, beautiful. And we love this, right? This idea that we are uniting communities around the world. Before I start, I'd like to encourage everyone to take a few deep breaths, right? A couple of things. Everyone in the world is experiencing, or most people in the world are experiencing, who are online are experiencing Zoom burnout. So if you can take a few breaths, right? Get yourself settled, make sure before the webinar starts that you have water, that you're comfortable. And we invite you to keep your screen on, right? But this is going to be an interactive webinar, we hope, as much as possible. We'll be using the chat, we'll be having dialogue with people. And a few things before I share the agenda, and I'll share what we'll be covering. Especially on this topic, I'd like to acknowledge that we all have different entry points in connection to this topic and life experiences that affect how we feel and how we think about it. And I hope to meet all of you where you are, and as we all continue to learn. My approach is grounded in the belief that it is essential for everyone, for all of us in every community, to build the awareness needed to take action. And that includes myself. I have made all kinds of mistakes in this work along the way, because racial equity work is not about being perfect, right? It's about making choices, making brave choices and new choices. And even though I've been working in this area for quite some time, for decades, my own learning is not finished, right? Everything I learn leads me to appreciate how much more I have to learn. And there's no completion, right? We're discussing the consequences of centuries of belief and behaviors. And although I hope it won't take centuries for us to address it, it will take time and effort. And not only effort on the parts of those experiencing inequity, but on the part of all of us who contribute to the inequity consciously or unconsciously. And it starts and ends with us, right? It's not just our organizations, but it's us. And it's not about blame, it's about change. So I came to this work through my work in wellness, education, and as a community activist. And all of that led me to partner with established organizations that had already been dedicated to addressing harms and disparities taking place based on race, ethnicity, gender, and socioeconomic status. I still am in partnership with many of those, and I will be providing resources toward the end. One other thing that I really wanted to make clear about today, and that I did in preparation for today, is that this is a global community. And so I am made the effort to, as best as I can, present information and resources that are applicable not only in the United States, right? As we know, this is not only a US issue. I will be presenting links to resources, and those will be put in the chat as we go and at the end of today. And if I miss putting one in as we go along, they will be in at the end. So I'm about to switch over to the agenda. I'm going to share my screen and switch over to the agenda. But while I do that, I'd really love to find out a little bit about why you're here today, right? What drew you in about the topic? And if you feel like sharing that, it would be great if you would put it in the chat. And one of the reasons for this is two things. I'd like to be very specific about information and responses. And the second thing is it will help us develop, as we're working on webinars to provide, it will help us plan for future events. So that would be really great. And you can do it now, you could do it as we move along, right? If something comes to mind to you. So I'm going to, I'm going to share the screen. Here we go. Play it from current slide. Okay, wonderful. So it's a lot, right? What we have here is a lot. And what is racial equity is the first thing that we're going to start with, because we really need to, we're not going to be doing a deep dive, right? We've got a huge amount to cover today, but we do want to cover some basics. So what do we mean when we say racial equity? What do we mean by race, racism, right? And to review that, of course, we all have our ideas about this, but when we can have a shared understanding of what we're referring to, that's going to be important. And that I'm going to be providing today, because we don't have a huge amount, these are very often workshops that take quite a bit of time. I'm going to be providing an overview, right? And a springboard for us to begin. It's an invitation, right? For us to begin taking more steps. As we move along, if you can post questions in the chat, that would be great. And again, I'll be reviewing those now. And today is going to be a little bit different than some of our other webinars, in that we've reserved quite a bit of time at the end to really have a more in-depth conversation for people who would like to continue both with questions and with discussions. So after we go through what is racial equity, we're going to go through why it's so hard to talk about, right? What is it that makes this such a difficult thing to talk about? Racial equity and in organizations, who's affected, where does it show up? Actions, accountability, and legacy. Being anti-racist and what that actually means. Action steps. What is racial literacy? Exploring racial socialization, education, and then a little bit about developing tools and strategic planning and assessments, and then Q&A, right? So as you can see, we have quite a bit. So I'm going to move us on. Hold on one second. I'm going to move us on to our next screen. which is racial equity, right? The condition and this definition comes from an organization called Racial Equity Tools. And I'm going to be putting that in the chat for you. They define racial equity as the condition that would be achieved if one's racial identity no longer predicted how one fares. So if the condition, right, so that they define it as the condition that would exist if our racial identities no longer predicted who we are and how we are in the world. And this includes elimination of policies and practices, attitudes, and cultural messages that may reinforce or fail to address different outcomes based on racial equity. The way they define working toward racial equity, or they frame working toward racial equity, is as a mindset, right? And methods for solving problems. And those problems are problems that have endured or existed for generations, that seem impossible or difficult to control, that harm people and communities of color, most acutely people of color. And ultimately, they affect people of all races. They affect us all. And that this requires seeing things differently, thinking differently, doing and working differently, right? So it requires quite a bit of open mind to begin how we operate on here. And so the next thing we want to move from racial equity is what we mean by race. And this is a basic dictionary definition, one of many, right? Is that any one of the groups of humans that are often divided into groups based on physical traits regarded as common among people of shared ancestry. So that we know that race, when we refer to that, is generally about, it's going to be about physical traits. And we're going to go a little bit more into race and what that means, and debunk some myths about it. But we're going to move to racism, a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. So racism is really based on who is superior and who is inferior. And very few people would admit that this definition of racism reflects their own views, but nevertheless, consciously or unconsciously, most people believe in or endorse some form of racist ideas, right? That again, this is not an issue of blame, but taking a little bit more of a responsibility of how we all have been socialized into some form of racial idea and ideas and racial thinking. So our next is looking at some issues. Yes, please go ahead, Laura.
That you see, one of the things that we as Women for Solutions see and are really focused on the caring economy is the importance of early education, because neuroscience and psychology tell us that most of this concepts of who is more valuable than others is actually it's a cultural thing that happens in early ages, from like 3-4 years old to 7-year-olds. So this is we can say that we can start to work on these very early on. Huh?
Right, and exactly, because the thing is that we are racially socialized, right? This happens from the time of birth. And what we want to do is begin changing the way that we think and how race is considered, what is considered racial and what is not in different countries changes. But what we want to do is begin to think how we're framing this in education, but also how we're reframing it for ourselves, right? Because once we've been racially socialized, we want to change, we may want to change the way that we're thinking, especially if we're talking about advancing the caring economy, or we're talking about advancing SDGs or any other ethical practices in B Corps. And when we go back to race, right? So we want to go, yes, please, Laura, go ahead.
No, you're mentioning a caring economy. Will you now mention to us what is for you the caring economy in this context of race and racism and equity, so that we can understand what tools you're going to then share with us for solving this problem?
It's a fantastic question, and I'm going to come to that just after we go through race and racism, but I want to get some of the semantics clear before we move to that point. Then I would really appreciate not only giving information, but any questions and discussion with that. I'm always really looking forward to and welcoming. So in terms of race and racism, one of the biggest issues that it unfortunately is not taught very often in school is race is a made up social construct. There is no base in actual biological fact, right? It's an ideology that assigns value to human beings according to certain physical characteristics, such as skin color, hair color, and texture, right? So there's scientifically, I can have more in common with someone who looks completely different from me, from a different place on the planet, than I can have by somebody who is next to me, who comes from my community, who looks the same as me. So it is a social construct that was made up, race. So race in a sense doesn't exist, except that the concept does. And where it really gets played out is in racism, right? And how it is applied is in racism. So race is often conflated also with ethnicity and culture. And it's, again, most often associated or coupled with skin color, eye shape, and hair texture. And one of my favorite ways of thinking about this, or metaphors, phrases I love, is from Ta-Nehisi Coates. And he refers to race as the child of, it is the child of racism, not the parent, right? So race is something that we made up, that human beings made up in order to further the ideals, the goals of racist behavior, to have power, right? These are power plays. And another way of thinking, another phrase that I love is that, or comparison, is that racism really is it is not the shark in the water, but it is the water that we swim in, right? That racism is truly something that we swim in on a daily basis. And the longer that we swim in cultures of racism, the more invisible they become, right? The less aware that we are. The third thing, so racism is a system of advantage and oppression. And it is has the intention of creating and sustaining systems and institutions that benefit preferred people, often whiter or lighter, at the expense of other groups. Racist oppression operates on 4 levels, right? Internal, interpersonal, institutional, and ideological, right? So we can be we can have internal racism, right? We can be racist and oppress our own selves. We can have it between others, right? Ourselves and others, interpersonal. Institutional, in how the systems and institutions we create, and ideological, in our thoughts. The next thing is that ideas and attitudes based on biases and prejudices drive racial categorizations and designations, right? And in the US, for example, in the US, designations, racial designations have changed over time. So for example, in the US, some ethnic and religious groups considered white right now were not considered white in the past, in previous eras. Spanish or Irish, Italian, Jewish people, and the racial designation of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders changed 4 times in the 19th century. Sometimes defined as white and other times not. Most often in relationship to exploiting or balancing or playing out African-American exploitation of labor. Not African-American exploitation of labor, but exploitation of labor with African-Americans at the expense of African-Americans. And then yet, we know that this is not just a US problem, right? We can see how this is played out, but to date, I have not, if anyone has, I'd love to know, but I have not heard of one country in the world that does not have some form of categorizing people by race. Even though the targets of mistreatment are not the same in every country, a very large number of people, right? Or the largest number of people in instances, the targets tend to fall into groups based on darker skin color and or indigenous peoples. And what I would really love for people to think about, or like people to think about right now is, and this may be something, of course, you've thought about in the past, but really thinking about who are the people right now in the countries that that you're living in at this moment. Who are the people right now that experience the most mistreatment based on race? And the second question is, then you may not be in your country of origin. So what about your country of origin, right? Who are the people there who experience the most mistreatment? And that can be coupled, right? That can be coupled by a number of things. I'm going to go on to the next screen, and then we're going to stop for a second to move on to a discussion. But what I would really love to talk about is some of the barriers, right, that we have to having a productive dialogue about racial equity. So some of the things, right, and if I haven't, anything that I miss on this list, I would love it if people would share in the chat anything that I may have missed on this list. So the first thing is some people have been socialized to consider themselves to be colorblind, right? We hear this all the time, I'm colorblind, which is actually not a possibility. We can't not see color unless we are literally colorblind. We cannot not see color. It would be like looking at anything and saying, I can't see the color of that, or I can't see sometimes. And now gender, of course, is something that may not be recognizable depending on the person, but we describe people by how they look. So say now how our attitudes about color may be different, but to say we are colorblind is really not helpful or effective. And it becomes a barrier. Talking about race in groups who are from different racialized experiences can also be a barrier, right? People may say, you have no idea what it feels like to be me, so I don't want to begin to have this conversation. And that limits, right? It may not stop, but it may limit the conversation that happens. The next is fear of offending, right? We very often say, I don't even want to start this conversation because I'm terrified. I'm going to stick my foot in my mouth, right? I might say something awful, right? This is where making brave choices to have brave conversations comes in, and learning how to have those. The next thing is the burden of having to educate other people about one's own experience of discrimination. And we see this very often. We say somebody who is non-white comes into a room and people say, well, can't you explain to us what it feels like to be discriminated against? And that's not exactly fair, right? That unless someone wants to share that experience, that shouldn't be the burden of someone else to explain that unless we have set up a different kind of situation. The next thing is power dynamics. And this plays out, we know this is not just in racial conversations, this is in gender, right? The cost of speaking up. And that can be personally, socially, and professionally. So people end up not having the discussion. Then comes lack of skills. Sometimes we don't either have the language or we don't have the listening skills to actually just hear someone. Very often we are either talking past each other or we're having a reaction that limits our ability to listen. So it's a different kind of listening that we have to employ. The next is a fear of being vulnerable and exposing ourselves in front of someone else. What if I say how I'm really thinking, right? And yet, if we can't say how we're really thinking, we're probably not going to move to a next place. For some, the issue hits home more than for others, and the issue is painful. For some people to talk about it, it is simply too painful. And so respecting how that feels to people, it may be that those discussions will happen in only certain circles for some people. Then there's hopelessness. Will talk bring any action? Why should we expect this conversation this time to change anything? It never has before. Why should it change something now? the next, right? We can see, right? There's a lot of barriers. This is the reason that the discussions don't happen. There's this huge amount of barriers. Many of us have been told all of our lives not to talk about certain issues in public, or especially at work, right? That's not something that we talk about. Many people have had bad past experiences talking about race, so they're hesitant. I'm not going to do this again. Intent versus impact. And this is a big one, right? Is that sometimes we say or do things that are hurtful to someone else, and we hurt that person. I mean, the result was hurtful, and we can say, I really didn't mean to, but it was hurtful. So going into these conversations and being able to say, I'm sorry, I acknowledge it was hurtful. Not I'm sorry and it's okay that it was hurtful, but I'm sorry that it was hurtful. And finally, some people are talking about their personal experiences, and other people are talking about the theory or the system. So for example, right, we have a conversation about racism in the healthcare system. A doctor may get very defensive because the doctor feels personally that they treat everyone fairly. And so they don't believe in that conversation. So I'm going to stop the share here. And what I would love to ask and put in chat, if you haven't already, I'm going to stop the share, is I have a couple of comments. Wonderful. Let's see. The reasons people are here. That's fantastic. Okay, beautiful. And we have more, right? That many are invisible because of inequality, right? That may be another reason. So I would love to invite either comments in the chat or questions or comments about the barriers that we experience. But maybe have conversations about race. Yeah.
Maybe at this point, can we also mention what how does a caring economy fall into this concept of gender inequality or diversity, and just to understand where you're going to in this conversation.
Absolutely, because in a caring economy, right, when we're talking about doing well for the most amount of people, right, and I'm going to go into that a little bit more in depth. But when we're talking about doing well and really looking at people's well-being and doing the least amount of harm, as well as keeping in alignment with the SDGs, right? We want to, what are the barriers? What's stopping that from happening? And very often what's stopping that from happening is that we're not even finding out where the issues lie, where the worst issues lie within organizations, within communities, because the conversation can't happen, right? And that the conversations are first and foremost. So we're about to go into that, but before we do, I would love to hear any responses to or thoughts about what is difficult about having these conversations in organizations or in your communities.
Yep. Marisa, good morning, everyone.
Hi,
and,
good morning.
Stanley. And thank you so much for presenting this such relevant and pertinent conversation. From my personal experience, I think it's difficult as an African American or Haitian American. I've lived in the US for many years. I live in Canada now. I think it's a difficult conversation to have because whenever you bring up this topic, people who are, and I'm speaking in general terms, right? So please take that into consideration. People who are white feel threatened by the conversation because they feel that the minute you bring this up, you are including them and calling them racist. And there's so many different definitions of racism. And so my daughter, who's 22 years old, studying psychology in Montreal, tells me that everybody is racist. And when she first said that, I had a hard time understanding. But then she defined it for me that we all have prejudices, we all have biases, so we're all racist. And because of the institutional racism that we live in, we have been socialized, as you said. And so I think maybe you can offer some tips. How can people across the line can have this conversation with the type of language that is not threatening or offensive or accusatory, but communicating that the problem is there. We're not, I'm not, as a Black person, I don't want to demonize a white person, but I do want them to be receptive to what I'm sharing so that we can together work out a solution. Because this concept of white privilege is real. But the minute you bring that up, at least in my network, people who are white feel offended and they feel the immediate need to defend themselves and say, no, the playing field is leveled, especially in the US, whether you're Black or white, it's equal opportunity. But we all know that that's not true. And so, how would you approach this conversation in a way that would um, help the person be more receptive? I'm talking for a Black person having this conversation with a white person.
Yeah. Thank you, Stanley. Thank you for the question. And for the reflection on experience, right? That is all too common. Is that what ends up happening is that we try to have these conversations without doing some of the work beforehand, and some of the work beforehand has to do with really beginning to roll out some of the skills and tools. And I'm going to cover a little bit about that today. But again, today is short. But really going into language, what's the language that we can use, and coming up with common language, right? That we language and definitions, so that people are on the same length of what that means. You had mentioned there are many definitions of racism, right? Which is why I said the source I used was one definition. And when we're working in a group of people, right? And if we're working in organizations, Laura, to apply this to organizations and how this happens organizationally, in an organization, some decisions have to be made, some planning has to be done to create common language, right? How are we going to go about this? And then structures, right? There have to be structures, because there's a lot of debate about whether or not you can create what's called safe space, because it's not. I love Mickey Scott Blay refers to it, Bay as brave space. Creating brave spaces versus safe spaces. How can we create the conditions to be able to have brave conversations? Because feelings are going to be hurt, right? The fact is, we all are racist. We all do have biases. So how do we begin to unpack those? Part of those, Stanley, the answer is it's, in some ways, I can simplify it, but it's a process. An example of one way that happens is through restorative circles. So really beginning to set up structures so that people can hear each other, and that there is a way for feedback to be delivered. And in those circles, hopefully, right, if it's done over time, then there's skill building. And that skill building has to do with listening. That skill building has to do with understanding and getting educated, right? Because we do have to have more education. White people specifically have to get more education, but everyone, right? We all need to understand more. And I have a couple of, I know I'm not answering your whole question, but it really has to do with putting a plan in motion. This is what we'll talk about at the end. What are the strategic, this is what we're going to be talking about at the end today. What are the plans that I can make in my group or my organization or my community right now in order to begin this work? Because it's a lifetime's work, right? It's been centuries in the making, so that in order to repair this work and to move to a new place, we're going to have to put things in place. I just want to take a look at some of the things in the chat. We move from doing less harm to interacting to net positive ways, right? That is one of the things, the intention that we're going to do what it takes to do less harm. And that, yes, the lack of self-awareness and genuine empathy is truly at the source. But that these are things that are not put into place in normal daily practice. And this is one of the things that we want to begin encouraging. So I'm actually going to flip back now I'm going to keep flipping back and forth a little bit, but I'm going to flip back, Laura, to address the question about caring economy now. And I would certainly welcome comments. I would welcome feedback as I do so. I just want to share the screen for a moment. And let's see. Let's go here. Wonderful. Just to look at, looking at the SDGs and seeing, and putting in the chat, if we're talking about racial equity, and I know that this is a particular group, so this is a group that has thought about this a lot, but which of these areas, which of the SDGs, which numbers would you say need to have more work, need to have more attention paid on racial equity, And put that in the chat. Which of the numbers of the SDGs need to have more attention paid, or additional attention paid? I won't say more, additional attention paid. All of them, right? It was in a little bit. It was a bit of a trick question, a trick answer, or But the fact is that it really all of them are affected. So when we think about a caring economy, balancing purpose and profit, by advancing SDGs, the connection to caring economy and racial equity is there. It's right there. Is that the first thing one of the things we're trying to do is advancing the purpose and profit, the balance of purpose and profit, that we're trying to implement changes for a more inclusive and regenerative communities. That requires racial equity. Prioritizing genuine caring for people and the planet. Identifying who's affected most by disparities. Care for women and children and future generations, and knowing that women who experience racial discrimination have an intersectional load of discrimination to deal with, They are both a woman, and they may be experiencing it because of the race they have. That's something by Kimberly Crenshaw, who has written about, who created the term intersectionality, is how many of our social identities come under the attack. Somebody said they can't hear me. I'm sorry about that. I think, okay, I think it's up. It may be on your end, Richard. So that, and I'm sorry, I do have sirens in the background here. One of the things that dealing with racial equity is a vital part of achieving, One of the things that we need to do, I'm sorry, hold on one second.
While that goes on, we can
living in New York, is one of the things that we intend to do by addressing racial equity is disrupting embedded policies and practices. And these are the same embedded policies and practices very often that deal with inequity for all kinds of reasons, not just based on race, but all kinds of reasons. And that, again, are coupled very well. Meant we hear you well. Thank you very much, Hela. And the second thing is a deeper examination and assessment of the ways existing power structures and systems maintain the status quo. So as soon as we begin to really look at where we lie in racial equity, our organizations lie in racial equity, then we begin to see where we can dismantle some of the existing power structures. And these become in forms of assessment, And there are all kinds of assessments that go of the community and the environment, looking where are people being exploited based on race. It comes under hiring, recruitment, training and assessment practices, product marketing, and develop. Who are we marketing to and why? And how is that maintaining racial inequity? Supply chains. How are the people not only that we are dealing with, but the people that are providing services for us? How are they doing with their racial equity? Research. We need to do research on the who are making investments on. And again, this is not new to people who are in the caring economy, but our financial investments, our human capital investments, our boards, our pensions, our board recruitments, and are those reflective of the communities that we really want to be serving? And there are consequences, and I'm going to stop sharing this now. But there are several consequences, right? There's a narrow view in innovation and development, a lack of community resources, right? When we begin to narrow, right? We begin to narrow who we are serving in our communities based on race, right? We also are contributing to the lack of community resources, disparities in education, which is a loss of talent development. We contribute to global mental illness if we're not addressing these. There's an agricultural imbalance, discrimination multiplied by intersectionality. And then of course, legacy. It's a huge field, and it is not only people who we may suspect who are affected. This is people at all levels of society. So what I would love to get some feedback from is, or interaction with, is where you see the greatest barriers or the greatest challenges in building racial equity in your organizations, right? If we are in organizations that are focused on doing well, doing good, right? And doing the least amount of harm, where are the challenges that you are experiencing? What are the challenges that you are experiencing in this?
I think one of the biggest issues is unconscious bias, and that is something that can be is like we can't say it's a disease, but it's something that we are raised with and has to be dismantled, and so creating the tools to move forward and become more conscious of that unconscious bias is one of the biggest issues, I think.
That's exactly that, which reflects what Stanley was talking about earlier, right? The fact that we may not even know where and what biases we have and where they are. And part of that has to do, since we don't have that as part of our education in school, most of us, hopefully that is going to begin to change, then we have to bring that to our organizations and our communities. So I want to play a very quick, it's just 2 minutes of a video, which is really expressing that. And this was it's a TED Talk by 2 young women who talk about the need for what we refer to as racial literacy, right? Because when we begin to talk about bias, we need to address racial literacy. So I'm just going to play this. I'm hoping, can people see? I'm going to stop share for a second because I have a feeling that I want to just make sure that I've got the right screen here. There we go. And share. Wonderful. Can people see the TED screen?
Yep.
Great. So I'm going to play this. It's just the first 2 minutes of this talk on what it takes to be racially literate. That was it. That's all I want to share of this. And it's to the point is that even young women who have been the targets of discrimination in the United States felt that they had never been able to have these discussions, right? That they had never learned any of this in school, and most of us don't. So the point is that we need to begin to implement ways to bring these racial literacy into our organizations as adults, into our communities. it is how we begin to make that's one way in which we began to make change. So the next thing is how we want to look at is, and now I would love to, any other responses when you're thinking of the caring economy and anti-racism or racial equity. Any other thoughts?
Well, I can say that one of the biggest things that you're mentioning is education, and this video is all about that. Tells you nobody's giving you the language nor the education to really focus on the bias we are born with. And so unconscious bias, I keep repeating, is one of our biggest problems in our society, because we have too many layers of biases, and so to really overcome them in a massive way, it will take a lot of effort, but I think it's the way to go.
And we need, looking at education, we have to, that's a huge deep dive. We know that the content in history, the history that it was taught, not only in the US, but in many places, has been whitewashed, right? It's based on colonization. And so how we begin to look at the ways that history has been taught means that if we're re-examining that, we then have to provide education for ourselves in other ways, and to promote education for ourselves in other ways. And that might mean in our organizations, that might mean in our communities. Are we providing opportunities to learn a more inclusive and a more accurate history of the way that the world has operated and how people have been discriminated against? This is part of the problem when, especially in discussing with white populations who have only heard a history based on whiteness. And when we begin to acknowledge that that may not be an accurate history, and people begin to become defensive, going back again to something that Stanley was talking about earlier, people begin to become defensive. How is this possible if I based my entire life on something that was not accurate, that was not true? So how do we begin bringing this into our organizations? How do we begin to bring this and extend it beyond just even our own businesses into our communities? And I would love to hear any thoughts about that before I move on.
I'd love to jump in. This is Eli. And I want to go back to what Stanley was saying. I really appreciated his comments because it goes, first of all, white people do really need to get over themselves and start listening and stop being defensive, because it's just perpetuating the problem. I feel very strongly around that, but it's very, very problematic for people of color. And I want to share a couple of experiences. Let me tell you, I am a human rights commissioner in my city. It is a city of almost 100,000 people. So I consider myself, right or wrongly, halfway woke, okay? Like, I'm not one of those completely clueless white people, right? So I think I'm clued in. I'm a freaking human rights commissioner, and we talk about this all the time because we have racism going on in our town. I'm on a committee that is called the Overdue Series, and we have decided for our town, we are going to put on a year-long program of really high-profile people like Ibram Kendi and all these wonderful people to come and talk to the community, all right? So we're having this conversation, and someone brings up, and I can't remember who it was, but the issue of sort of white defensiveness. So I think I'm going to be helpful. I think I'm going to be an ally. I think I'm going to be, an accomplice in the cause by saying, you know what, I totally agree. And I think that we just have to go forward and go forward boldly. And white people are just going to have to deal. And if they're a little uncomfortable, like, too bad. How about 400 years of discomfort? How about that? And so I think I'm doing something helpful. I was taken to church in front of 30 people by a wonderful woman of color. And I want to tell you why. And I was stunned. And she said, you know what? You're completely out of line. And I'm thinking, how can I be out of line here? I think I'm saying something helpful. She said, if this doesn't work, you get to go back to your life as usual. If this doesn't work, people of color have to go back to the same old BS. And I realized, oh my God, even in trying to do something right, there was bias, there was cluelessness. Like I wasn't thinking about the nuances of it and things like that. This piece of it is so important for white people to really understand the experience, of others and what the consequences have been and could still be. I mean, it was a really profound moment for me. I felt awful. I wrote an email to her afterwards, with abject apology, and she was extremely gracious. And she said, no, I really appreciated actually what you said, but it's important that this other stuff. And it was a really wonderful moment. But anyway, I just share that.
No, and I'm so grateful, Eli. It's a fantastic point in that one of the things that people avoid, right? One of the reasons people avoid even learning or having these discussions is I'm going to feel icky. I might not feel great. And that's part of the change. That's part of really, and knowing you're going to we're all, as a white person, I'm going to step in it.
Yeah.
And I'm going, right. And I'm going to be called, I'm going to be called out on my own stuff because I don't even know what my stuff is.
And we have to invite it, you know
Right.
what I mean? And stopping defensive. It's all true. We are a nation founded on slavery. It is still with us today. Like if we can't own that, and you know what I feel, let me just say it and I'll get off my soapbox. We have participated and benefited from all the benefits of racism, and we now have to assume all the responsibility. And that includes things like, reparations and all that, because generationally we have inherited. It's a matter of inheritance. What did you inherit? I inherited the privilege and benefits of racism. And so I have to also inherit the responsibility.
And this is a lifelong thing. We're talking about centuries and centuries. And again, I want to go back a little bit to the fact that this is an international community, which means that it's, people who say, well, that's just in the US. It's not just in the US. Right? It is something that exists around the world. I was talking to a young friend who lives in the Philippines, and she was talking about how this affects the indigenous populations in the Philippines, but almost exclusively the indigenous populations, because there are several indigenous populations in the Philippines. It is based on color still. A darker person, right? We know that this is true in many countries. And the thing is, we are consciously or unconsciously, very often unconsciously, but saying we're unconscious is not enough, right? How do we become conscious? And we have to become conscious by being very active about it. So a couple of things I want to go to, and thank you for mentioning Kendi, because that's what I'm about to talk about. He's a wonderful scholar. Ibram X. Kendi is a wonderful scholar. Being an anti-racist, I'm sure many of you have heard of his book, or maybe not if you haven't. But I want to provide a few resources. But a couple of the things is we are living in this amazing time. We have videos, we have books, we have articles, we have access to watching and listening. And I'm going to really stress the listening to what other people say and noticing when we have a reaction, right? As a white person, when I feel myself have an emotional reaction, I'm going to ask myself, what do I have to learn here? Maybe there's something for me to learn. Why am I having that reaction? And that we can't leave that to be someone else's job, right? There are people like Jane Elliott, who is an amazing educator who who created these experiments in anti-racism that would never be allowed today. right, with young children. What is really astounding is that the young children she did those experiments with, the majority of them have become active anti-racists as adults because they were socialized to from a young age to begin thinking that way, right? So we need, this is it, it's an ongoing process. Thank you. Thank you, Eli. Any other responses or thoughts before I move on?
If I may say something, just briefly, um, I was very um, what Eli said resonated with me deeply, and so I appreciate her for the work she's doing and what she said. Briefly, what I'd like to bring up is the fact that there's fear. There's fear to have this conversation. And one thing you said, Marisa, that I thought was really powerful is that we have to clarify our intent in having these conversations. And we're talking about a system that is unjust and that needs to be repaired, but we're not talking about the reversal of a system where, quote unquote, the oppressed class become the oppressors. We're not talking about a revolution, we're talking about reparation of a system. And so I think maybe equipping people with the right words to communicate intent can help facilitate the conversation and develop this receptiveness to change. I know in my network, when I talk to white brothers and sisters and friends, that's what we call them, and our church community, I think the resistance comes from the fact that oftentimes they feel demonized because the language is not the right language, and they feel threatened. We're all broken. Everybody's broken. Everybody uh, has hurt and offended and participated in the system. And so I think it's important that the language be right. So
No, thank you, Stanley. And that's it, yes, intention as well as action, because very often what happens with a wider population is, well, I did a few things, which kind of brings in the savior complex business of, well, I came in and I did the right thing, but it's a lifetime of things, right, that it's going to require. This is not just one event. It's not going to one protest or doing one event. It's how are we making these habits, and finding language for it is huge. Finding a common language, and that language might be different for different communities as they begin to find language, agreements, structures, right? So there are all kinds of ways, and I'm about to present some of those. Again, that's a much deeper dive, but there are very specific. I've done this in over 350 schools in New York City, where we really we create structures to have these conversations, and they're not something that you do once and that's handled. This is something that it's a 3 to 5 year process just to get that going, right? So that, and it's not that you can't have the discussion for 3 years, but it takes time. It's building community. It's building these practices into our businesses. And so in a sense, going back to attaching this to a caring economy, Laura, or organizations that are doing this, how are our businesses, how are our organizations building this into our models? Are we taking the time to say, because it takes time, are we making the investment of time to have these conversations, to have the difficult conversations, and also to invite people who we don't hear from, the people who, not only people who are discriminated against, but really begin to hear some of the biases that are there. Because once we can get those out, then we can repair them. But when we keep shoving them down and hiding them, right, we want to become aware of where our biases lie. So it has to do with there's education in here, and this is self-education, but also education in our organizations, and not just in schools, in our communities, in our homes, in our businesses. So that how much time are we taking out every day? So I'm just going to share a screen now, because the time has passed actually very quickly today, as it does in these conversations in my experience. is some action steps. And I'm just going to play this from this screen. So when we're looking at racial literacy, and this is a Kendi quote, right? An anti-racist, the definition of being an anti-racist is one who supports I'm sorry, I made a typo here, anti-racist policies and behaviors through their actions or expressing anti-racist ideas, but on a regular basis. He makes it very clear this is a lifetime thing. This is not somebody who comes in and makes a statement once or puts it into a mission statement, but this is somebody who you can really see and measure the same way we measure SDGs. How are we measuring these behaviors? And so it's racial literacy, right? Exploring our racial socialization. What were our personal histories? How did we learn about race? Our orientations to race, education, books, videos, lectures, articles, classes. There's lots that's out there. Developing tools, and here we go back again to what we were talking about with Stanley, the language. Are we finding the language and the definitions, not just the definitions, but the semantics? How do we want to describe these? Structures, agreements, constructive dialogue, reflection tools, right? Do I have tools that help me reflect on this in a way that pushes me a little bit? Listening skills, emotional awareness, which includes the ability to self-regulate, conflict management, and then we can get, because we can't go into strategic planning unless we're actually doing something, but we can begin the short term. What are we going to do short term and then long term? And then we go to accountability measures. So I just want to show you, let's see. This is another one of the videos, and this is by a Megan Ming Francis, and she's a professor at University of Washington. And this is this is going to be in the resources. It's an excellent TED Talk to watch. And she describes the situation that several that she has encountered, but one in particular that's very powerful about the discrimination that she has experienced and how she had to use her education card, her literacy card, to be able to deal with it, right? That I'm an educated person and that's how I got around it. But what happens to people who are not, right? Now, the next thing I wanted to show is just a quick example of agreements, right? So these are the kinds of agreements, and this goes back to, in a sense, to Stanley, if we're talking with white people, right? This is one of those things that I would want to be, make very clear before I have a conversation, is making some basic agreements. And this is an example of some of those. And people would create them themselves, but then going to kind of, looking at some of the basics that we need to have an honest conversation. So asking people, make a goal of being open and curious about new learning. Are we asking people to grapple with new ideas? And understanding that there's a significant difference between my opinion and knowledge based on information. We can always come back to our opinions. We don't have to hold on to them tightly. Letting go of personal anecdotal evidence and moving on to broader level patterns and experiences so that we can actually hear what other people experience. And that, again, going back, if I feel defensive, what can I learn from this? That we are individuals and we are members of social groups, and that those social groups have formed our reactions, and really thinking about that before we have the discussion. And again, identifying the difference between safety and comfort, and knowing that discomfort is critical in these conversations. And how am I applying, right? What is my learning edge, and how can I apply what I've learned? The last thing, especially for the participants here who are white, is to really make space. So that we're not taking the space in the conversation always, and that it is not centered around us. So I'm going to stop the share for a second. And what I would like to show you, I'm gonna move because we're going to be wrapping up because I want to go into the Q&A. But I do want to give one example of big corporation and some of the commitments that they're making. Now, they're not making it, they say they're making it from a racial literacy perspective, but we'll see if that happens. And one of the things that at least I know Microsoft is doing is that they've hired a couple of people to hold them accountable. And that's one of the things for long term. Are we as an organization, our individual organizations, are we, once we make our plans, what is our accountability plan as well? And what is going to hold us accountable? So I want to show you a screen there we go, of what Microsoft and Apple have just released this last year. Whoops, go back. What Microsoft and Apple just released this year. So Microsoft has said, and we'll see if it happens, Microsoft has said that they're committing 150 million to internal DEI. 50, now they're putting dollars here. We'll see what those actions turn into dollars. And this is, there's a friend of mine who's a scholar who's working on the accountability measures here. 50 million in funds for Black-owned businesses, 23 million in financing and training partners and employees to double the number of employees in senior positions by 2025. 100 million to minority-owned depository institutions, 50 million toward existing justice reform initiatives, and then digital skill training for African-American communities that have been disproportionately have had less access. Apple has also donated, they committed money, 100 million to educational access, national equity initiatives, and criminal justice reform. We have to see what those turn out to be and whether or not they hold true to maintaining those. So I would like to, I'm going to move to the last screen before we go to Q&A, which is this. And a couple things to come in, to think of in mind as we move forward is, quotes, which I always like to use as a reminder. As Michelle Obama said, race and racism is not a reality that is a reality that so many grow up learning to just deal with. But if we ever hope to move past it, it just can't be people of color who deal with it. It's up to all of us, Black, white, everyone, no matter how well-meaning we think we might be, to do the honest, uncomfortable work of rooting it out. And given the fact that people of color have done the work primarily or given the work primarily, my feeling very much is to promote the work being done by white people who have not had to deal with this on a daily basis. Second is James Baldwin, that we might have disagreements of opinion, right, for all kinds of reasons. We might have political differences, we might have philosophical, religious differences, but we can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression, from James Baldwin. And Maya Angelou, that prejudice is a burden that confuses the past, threatens the future, and renders the present inaccessible. That this is something, racism affects all of us. This is not just people it is not just the targets of the mistreatment, but it affects all of us and destroys who we are as a species. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I would love to we've only got 15 minutes left. I would love to answer questions. I don't know if there are any questions, Laura, in the chat that we had that we didn't answer. If we have any questions, reflections, thoughts. I call it what's in the ether.
Yeah, maybe you can give us a more example of daily life actions that can be taken in either in person or actions that can be taken in a community or in businesses to further gender or diversity.
So for racial diversity, right? So racial equity, what we really, one of the daily practices is that you have it spot on, Laura, in that it's a daily practice. Can we ask our people within our organizations, right? People that we hire, people that we are working with, what are they doing every day? Can we ask ourselves that question? What have I done today? Have I read something? Have I listened? Have I researched? Have I watched? Have I taken an action? Right? And so it can look different for different people, but what am I doing every single day? So it's not something, it's not, we're not talking about a racial equity month. We're talking about, right? Or a week. We're talking about these being practices and habits. And what are some of the practices and habits? Am I making it a habit? Am I dedicating and committing myself that I am going to go listen to communities who are experiencing discrimination, and I'm just going to listen? I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to listen so that maybe I can begin to invite a conversation later. That's one step. Maybe I take a course in emotional self-regulation so that I understand my feelings, so that when I do get activated in these conversations and I feel like my head is going to explode, right? And I've had a trigger, what am I going to do with that trigger, and how am I going to manage that so that I can have a conversation? That's another, right? That's another thing that we can do. Another is learning conflict tools, conflict management tools, right? And these, even Laura, from Nonflict. Can we learn to have conversations with people that we disagree with so that we can learn how they think that is different from the way that we think, right? That involves listening, that involves dealing with our own emotions. Those are just some beginning places to start. And I'm about to put into the chat, these are I'm not sure if it went through. These are the links to some videos to watch. And I'm also going to put a link in to, I will put some books, some books and resources, some authors to research. So that we know that there's plenty. Oh, poor Richard. I'm so sorry, Richard. Your sound seems to keep going out. But we're very happy that you were here. Hope that you'll be able to hear it possibly on a replay. So that's one thing. Those are some ideas, Laura, right? And that we also begin to learn about having things like restorative circles or community circles. What is that? Can I go to a town hall? Can I find out about the education in my community and the access to education in my community? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it's a great perspective, because I think that change always comes from inside. You can't expect to change institutions if you don't change your inside first. And I think it's a great practice, but it's not easy to instill a daily practice of awareness of these things, unless there's a institutional country, school. It's comes from all over, from every aspect of life, 360 degrees from all over the place, so that we can really move forward fast. Because inequality as climate change are the two burning issues of our society, and if we don't get it soon, we will, it's going to burn us alive, I see.
Well, and I also think that getting into the habit of asking ourselves difficult questions, or questions we don't know the answer to. Because when I ask myself the question, am I going to send my child to a school that I feel doesn't have the resources, that doesn't have the access, right? I might say, no, I'm not going to do that because I have the advantage, right? Because of my education, mostly because of my color, but because of my education, right? And other things that I have that allow me access. Now, I'm taking advantage of my privilege there. So what can I do? Can I either switch which school that I'm going to send. Am I going to send my child to the school that has less access so that I can really find out? And if I'm not willing to do that, am I going to take an action that is going to see what I can do to problem solve that? Right? So that rather than saying, I don't want to really look at that, that's like really an unpleasant thing for me to look at. How can I begin to look at that, right? That I am when we begin to look at what we are the beneficiary of,
Yeah.
That's another habit. Anyone else? Any other thoughts or questions?
Or maybe you can mention what, in your experience when you've worked with companies, what have you done specifically to help in this issue?
Create a strategic plan, to create an absolute plan. Usually that has to do, in my experience, that has to do with creating structures. Again, I'm going to go back to structures, creating structures so that, is there a regular time to have these conversations? Are there reflection tools that we have provided? Is there a common language? Have we provided an opportunity? Have we looked at the assessment of every place that we can think of where racial equity plays a role? And can we find out from other organizations who have done it what we're missing? Where, one of my favorite questions is, where is my blind spot? Where are our blind spots? What have I missed? So that we're not only focused on achievement, but that we're also focused on really expanding our understanding. So that, but beginning to create the structures, make a plan, have an accountability for it. Who's going to make sure that we're having this discussion whenever we're having this discussion? Who's going to make sure to provide the resources that we're doing the learning? How is the assessment being handled? Yeah.
And that's very interesting. And you also mentioned that is there any differences between how you deal in these issues regarding communities, like Eli mentioned, because it's a little bit different to deal in a school with this issue, in a company, when in a community where it's more open, it's less structured.
Well, first thing you have to do is ask the community, right? Because there's no cookie cutter for this work. You have to go to the community and say, what are you willing to do? What do you want to learn? And we start there. That's why I began today's session with meeting people where you are, because people are at different places in the work. So what is it that we can handle and want to achieve right now? And then to continually re-ask ourselves. It's the same thing with agreements. When we make agreements about having conversations, difficult conversations, we need to keep revisiting those agreements as trust builds so that we can deepen the conversations that we're having, so that we can begin to push our own edge a little bit and find out again where our blind spots may be, because we're going to have plenty of blind spots. And most people will avoid what feels uncomfortable. I do, right?
So if you see the history from maybe 5, 10, 50, 60 years ago, since World War II, do you see that the acceleration of improvement on this, on the bias we have, is it moving fast enough? Do you think it's
well, it's definitely not moving fast enough. But in my opinion, it is definitely not moving fast enough. But it's also, this is a huge issue that comes up in conversations all the time, of people saying that there has been a huge amount of progress and people saying there's been no progress at all. And it depends on who you are and what skin you're wearing, and what skin do you inhabit, and how do you experience the world? If I am a young Black man living in the United States, I'm probably going to have a very different experience about feeling that anything has happened, because I can't run without being worried that I might get shot. I can't drive without worrying that I might get stopped and killed. right? So it depends on what reality we inhabit. So are we viewing it from the outside? Are we viewing it from the inside? But it's an interesting question. It's a great question, but it's a question that is very complex and really depends on people's individual viewpoints of it. So historically, there are some things that have possibly moved forward, and there are many things that have moved in some ways quite backward at the moment, or perhaps, as many people will argue, has become just simply more exposed. It was already there, just simply more exposed.
Exactly. So we have maybe 2 or 3 minutes left. Would you like to just give us a few words to conclude this webinar that was very interesting, very profound, with a lot of real solutions or suggestions of how and what to do to move forward in these issues?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for coming. It's really been, it's always a pleasure. It's always an honor to be able to share information. I think the thing to do for each one of us is we have to look at, we don't have to, I invite people to begin to look at what is the edge, where can I push myself? And if I don't know how and where to push myself, to begin to look at some of the sites, resources. I just put into to the chat a list of authors. Watch the videos that I've put in that will bring in new perspectives about implicit bias, about what it is like to be Black in Berlin, about the lie that invented racism, which is actually a brilliant talk. So I think the thing I would leave you all with is, find your edge and push it regularly, so that, which hopefully then will have a ripple effect in our families, in our communities, and in our organizations.
Wow, this is fantastic, because it's true. I mean, bringing this not only in your family, in your work environment, in your community, really, and if everybody does their little actions of introspection and seeing where we are, where we're going to find that need, that nobody is more valuable than others. We are all as valuable as human beings. There's no life that is less valuable. And with that, I have to say that thank you very much for all this information and really giving us really a great insights. And with that, I would like to thank you all for being on the call. We will send the recording and all this material in whoever registered for the webinar. We will be sending that very soon by email. And I want to remind you that our next webinar is March the 4th, this Thursday at 5 p.m. Central European Time. And the topic is reconnecting to the source, the new science of spiritual experience, how it can change you and how it can transform the world. The speaker is an amazing and profound philosopher, Ervin Laszlo, and he will give us his vision after in his 80th birthday, about what he sees and where we're going and how we can really move forward to a more conscious society. On that, I would like to thank everybody, and we will see you hopefully this Thursday.